Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 28. No land on which a battle is fought goes unscathed, and a defeated people is never allowed to repair the ravages of their land without interference. The South was prostrate. The land was ravaged, and the people were destitute. Liberation of the slaves, though morally right, raised new problems. Here was a race of people suddenly free by law, but completely without property or possessions or means of sustaining life. Many were as children who had suddenly become orphans. Though the land remained, buildings lay in ruin. Food and money were rare. Roads and bridges were impassable. The political situation made life even more miserable. Congress refused to allow elected delegations from the South to serve in the government. The South was put under military rule. The Negro was given the vote, while the white Southerner sympathizer was deprived of his right to vote. The greatest loss was that of human life. There was hardly a home left untouched by the war. But though the war was legally declared at an end, the end was not yet. Yankee renegades and troops believed the axiom, "To the victor goes the spoils," was justification for acts of vandalism, thievery, rape, and even murder. Since the defeated rebels had no legal means of retaliation for these heinous crimes, they resorted to violence in their own defense. Fear tactics were employed on both sides. In every settlement where the carpetbaggers and scalawags appeared, they were shortly followed by the Ku Klux Klan, who dealt out swift justice. The citizenry reacted in horror at the violence perpetrated by both sides, but neither had a monarchy on law and justice. The first effort to hold court in Cherokee County following the end of the war resulted in bloodshed and confusion. Hatred and bitterness were everywhere. Tensions ran high. The entire male population converged on the county seat for the event. Some went out of curiosity, some were there to keep the peace, and others were there to cause trouble. The courtroom was filled. The judge had to threaten to clear the courtroom before order could be attained. Out of respect for the court, the crowd remained orderly until adjournment for the day was called. As the crowd poured en masse to the large town common, it became evident that a goodly number were armed. Guns and pistols appeared as the crowd became a mob. When young lawyer Boone emerged from the courthouse, the crowd developed an ominous quiet. The lawyer hesitated on the steps, looked nervously at the crowd, then nervously proceeded to make his way to the John Hennessy house, which was across the town common. A voice broke the silence. "We'll learn you, you semblin'-headed upstart. You can't run our courts." There was the sharp report of a gunshot, and Lawyer Boone crumpled to the earth. Then a full-fledged battle ensued. Rebel bullets whizzed towards Jim Morrow. Morrow mounted the nearest horse, which happened to belong to Jim Whitaker, and made his escape. When ammunition became exhausted, the men hurried to the nearby houses for more. Returning to the scene of the battle, the replenished rebels turned on Fate Morrow, brother of Jim. Balls whistled, women screamed, men ran hither and yon, falling to the earth for protection. "Jim got away, but I'll get Fate, boys," yelled one of the men as Fate Morrow fell mortally wounded and was carried, dying, to the Ramser Hotel. Mrs. Ramser screamed, "Great God, this man is dying. Get Doc Patton quick. Oh, this is horrible." Finally, the smoke and tumult began to clear and passion wane. It was then that another casualty was discovered. Captain Cooper lay groaning in the street. "God Almighty, folks, what's wrong with Captain Cooper?" asked Hamilton Hayes. "Boys, I'm shot. See here on my side? I'm bleeding. Please carry me down to Doc Patton's." During the removal of Captain Cooper, Hamilton Hayes asked, "Did any of you boys find what became of Jim Morrow?" John Stockup made answer, "He made his getaway. I followed, and a man told me he ran the horse until it fell and that he saw him take off afoot." But what do you know, boys? That poor old faithful horse got up and staggered back up here and fell dead in the very spot where Jim got shot. That night, following the court scene, Agnew related the events to his mother and ended by saying, "Mother, it was as bad as the battles I saw during the war. But now that the war is over, it was worse. It wasn't strangers who were fighting. It was people who have known each other all their lives. It just about made me sick. I don't think I can stand any more of this. I still think sometimes I want to go someplace away from here. Surely there is some place that is at peace." Margaret shook her head. "I'm truly sorry to hear of this horror, but, my son, some day we will have peace again. It won't come until we all work together to bring it about." The new year arrived, but it was not greeted by the usual resolution of living in peace and harmony with one's neighbors. At least there was no let-up in the hatred and corruption on all sides. The Reconstruction period brought injustices to the entire nation. It brought needless debt, retarded recovery, and created a gulf between the black and white population and among neighbors that had not existed in the past. One day, Thomas C. Tatham, who was the bearer of political news, came to the inn for his mail. "I've heard some great news. I've said it all along. The Ku Klux Klan could do some good. We have a Klan right here in Valleytown." Agnew interrupted old Tom's speech, hoping to urge him to get to the point. "But what's the good news?" "You know that Governor Holden, well, he appointed General Kirk, the same one that raided and burned us out, to hang and imprison good men. The KKK took over and put the fear of God into some of them. Ended up with Holden's being impeached. They just threw him out of office. Now maybe some decent man will get put in that office." Margaret's eyes danced with some of the old sparkle. "Oh, Mr. Tatham, that's the best news we have heard for a long time. Maybe you're right. Maybe we can have peace again." Agnew still could not find the peace he was looking for. He was restless and unhappy. Finally, one night, he lingered after the others had retired. Margaret knew he had something on his mind. She was aware of his inner turmoil and had a premonition of his needs, but she dreaded to hear him voice his thoughts. She tried to keep her tone natural as she asked, "You have something you want to tell me, son?" Agnew responded, "Mother, ever since I came home from the war, I've been restless and dissatisfied. Things are so different now. There's so much corruption, cruelty, and hatred. I don't feel like I can stand it any longer. I wanted to stay here and help you as long as you needed me. I thought I could help at the trading post, but we had to close that. There doesn't seem to be any future for me here." This was as Margaret feared. Of course, she didn't want him to leave, but she also knew she'd be wrong to try to hold him. "What do you want to do? Have you made plans?" "You know Dr. Washburn, who owns the land and bluff below the graveyard? Well, he leased it to Mr. Mundy from Aquan after he came back from the war. He went out west and started a sewing machine business. He sells the Wheeler and Wilson machine. It's great for women who make dresses and things. They don't have to sew them with their hands. You could make a garment in half the time it takes to sew one by hand." Margaret couldn't resist smiling as she watched Agnew's enthusiasm as he discussed the attributes of this labor-saving invention. Agnew noticed her smile and paused, a little embarrassed. "I guess I sound like a salesman already," he said. Then he returned to his explanation. "I had a letter from Dr. Washburn a few days ago. He says things are peaceful out west and that there are opportunities there for a young man." "But, son, how would you get there? It takes money to go places, and we just don't have it." "I could help a little, but not enough." "Oh, he knew we didn't have any money. He said he would send me enough to get me out there and to help out until I got started. Said if I would come and work for him, he would pay my expenses, and then I could pay him back a little at a time out of my wages." "I guess that about settles it, then." Margaret was unhappy at this turn of events, but she didn't want to show it. nor did she want Agnew to feel duty-bound to stand by her. She also realized the truth in Agnew's argument that there was little opportunity for a young man here in the war-torn South. Finally, Margaret sighed and asked, "Where is Dr. Washburn? I hope it won't be too far. I hope you'll be able to come home once in a while." "It's pretty far, Mother. I hate to have to go that far, but it's Leavenworth, Kansas." Margaret couldn't restrain a sharp cry. "Oh no, Agnew, not all that way. Why, it's thousands of miles from here." While her heart refused to accept this, her mind told her that Agnew's decision to go west was essential if he were to find happiness. She had withstood many disappointments and sorrows in the past, and she knew that for her son's sake she would have to face this, yet another sorrow. Aloud she said, "Agnew, I'm sorry about the tears. Of course I hate to see you go, but you will find education and advantages in the cities, and if it's that what you want to do, then go, and may God go with you." "Your father and I have always been proud of you," continued Margaret as she sat with her hands tightly clenched in her lap to conceal their trembling. "Now I know how Grandmother Walker must have felt years ago when your father decided to leave Wilkes County and come with the wagon train here to Cherokee County. Grandfather Walker's parting words to Billy were to buy land, pay his debts, and always be honest. Your father heeded those words, and I hope you will take them with you as you journey west in search of opportunity and a peaceful life." She reached over the table beside her and picked up a Bible and handed it towards Agnew. "I want you to take this with you. Read it often." As Agnew put out his hand to take the Bible, she drew it back and opened it and said, "This is the 8th verse of the 6th chapter of Micah. I'll read it to you. 'He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God.' That's the very best advice that I can give you." Agnew was greatly moved by his mother's words and knelt beside her and kissed her. "Thank you, Mother," was all he said, but those brief words held a depth of meaning. So, Margaret once again watched her firstborn leave home. This leave-taking, though sad, was far from the heartbreaking one that took her son off to war. Chapter 29. As the young ones come to the family in an orderly succession, so too is the parting. It wasn't many months following Agnew's departure until Pitt came to his mother, ready to discuss his plans. Margaret was aware of his need to discuss matters with her when he remained in the kitchen one morning following breakfast, after the others had all gone to attend their chores. "Pitt, what's on your mind?" asked Margaret. "Hope there's nothing wrong." "No, there's nothing wrong, Ma. It's just that I'm 17 and I think I ought to go to work. Captain Cooper wants me to clerk for him at his store over beyond Red Marble Gap. I think I'd like to have a store of my own someday like Pa. It would be a good experience for me to work with Mr. Cooper. Would you mind if I go down there?" "No, son, of course I don't mind. I'll miss you, and I do dread to see my children leave home. As you say, you are now old enough, and the time has come for you to think about what you want to do. You're probably right about thinking you would enjoy working in a store. You have always been a trader. I remember one time when you were little, and in school you traded your McGuffey's reader for a knife. Your father would have whipped you, but I begged him not to. In fact, it seems to me you've been trading things most of your life." Pitt breathed a sigh of relief. "I was afraid you might not let me do this. I figured you might make me keep on going to school. Of course, I would rather you go back to school, but I know you were never as interested in book learning as your brother Agnew. I also know it'd be hard to settle back into the routine of formal learning after having served in the war. So if you're sure this is what you want, and if your mind is made up, that's fine. Go ahead and take the job for Mr. Cooper. I'm sure you'll be a success." Pitt grinned, got his coat, his scant belongings, and wended his way to the gateway of manhood to make his way in the world. That very day, Margaret heard from Agnew. He had reached his destination. He was in St. Louis, where he was to stay for a time. Then he was to go on to Leavenworth, Kansas. Margaret felt a sense of relief in knowing that Agnew was safe. She read his letter through several times, enjoying the feeling of nearness that his letter brought her. Time did not stand still. As Margaret's boys were growing into manhood, her younger sisters, who had been just babies when their father died, were now developing into pretty young ladies. Margaret was happily taking note of the rapid changes in her family as she sat rocking on the porch one day during a rare moment of leisure in her usually busy schedule. Her reverie was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Pitt. "Why, Pitt, what are you doing home here in the middle of the week? Is there something wrong?" Pitt grinned. "Now, Ma, do you always have to think something's wrong when I show up?" She could tell by his teasing that things certainly were not wrong. Pitt continued, "Didn't I tell you I wanted to clerk for Mr. Cooper a little while to get some experience? Well, now I've got it, and I want to reopen Pa's store." Margaret beamed. This was her dream, one of her sons running Billy's trading post. But the ever-practical Margaret immediately started asking practical questions. "Do you think you can manage it already? Do you feel that you've had enough experience? Where would we get the money?" "Oh, I'm sure I can manage it. After all, I worked for Father a lot, don't forget that. As for money, I've already looked into that. Mr. Abram Collett told me long ago that he had managed to keep his gold hidden from the Yankees during the war, and he said he would loan me a little if you would go on my note. Of course, I will pay him back with interest just as soon as I can. Will you sign the note for me, Mother?" "You know I will. We can move the post office back into the store. I believe it's been long enough since the war that they will be willing to appoint you postmaster now. Things have changed a lot." Pitt was elated. "Thanks a lot, Mother. I'll go up and talk with Mr. Collett." He impulsively grabbed his mother up from her chair and hugged her tightly. "Someday I'll pay you back. I'll take care of you." "You're a good boy, Pitt, even if you do trade off your school books," said a happy Margaret. "Ah, Mother, will you ever forget that?" There she was, once again packing food for the owner of the trading post to go over the mountains to purchase supplies for the store. This time, however, the owner was her son, instead of her husband. In due time, this same son was named the postmaster of the Valleytown post office. Every day continued to bring changes. Margaret's younger sister, Harriet, was married. The next sister went to Memphis, Tennessee, to work. This left only the youngest, Aoi, at home with her mother. With each letter from Agnew, Margaret felt the distance that separated them more keenly. However, it was when she received the letter telling her that he was getting married that she broke down and cried. The distance had now become in her mind an insurpassable gulf. The younger boys were distressed to see their mother's tears. Young George asked pitifully, "Does that mean we won't ever see Agnew again?" Once again, Margaret was called upon for a show of outward strength that was far from what she was feeling inside. "Of course we'll see him sometime. Listen, he says his new wife's name is Ora Odell, and she's from Leavenworth, Kansas. And guess what? She is a cousin of Buffalo Bill. Just think of that." This immediately interested the boys much more than Margaret's second statement that their new sister-in-law was an accomplished musician. Once the boys were satisfied that the news from Agnew was acceptable, Margaret took her leave. She felt the need of telling her mother. Mary was standing at the door as Margaret came rushing up the front steps. When she saw the letter in Margaret's hands and the tears in her eyes, she immediately assumed there was something wrong. "What's wrong? Has something happened to Agnew?" Margaret sobbed. "Mother, Agnew says he's getting married, and I don't even know the girl." Mary Scott laughed. "Why, Margaret, I thought from the way that you were carrying on that he might be dead. Why, you should be happy instead of crying. You know Agnew has sense enough to pick a nice girl. What does he say about her?" Shamefaced, Margaret laughed through her tears. "I'm acting silly and I'm ashamed. It was such a shock. Of course, I want him to marry and have a family and be happy. It just takes some getting used to." "I know mothers always cry when their children get married," said Mary. "I did when you got married, but that didn't mean I didn't want you to be married and have a family of your own. I guess it's especially hard when the first one decides to get married, but then it's just as hard for the next, and maybe even harder when it comes to the baby leaving home. But that's all part of living. Each individual has a right to live his own life." As usual, Mary's words helped Margaret to face her problem, and as she left her mother that afternoon, instead of going directly back to her own home, Margaret did as she had done so many times in the past. She walked up Junaluska Creek and communed with the mountains. "Here is my sylvan sanctuary. Here are my beloved mountains, one heaped on the other. It is always clean and fragrant here, always vital and alive, yet peaceful with ever-changing forms of beauty. Majestic trees meet overhead, forming a cathedral roof, and the crystal-clear river at my feet. I thank God for his gift of this great forest and the water," she prayed aloud. "God, forgive my tears today. It is hard to give up my boy, but, of course, I want him to marry, to have a wife, a home, and children. Grant, God, that he finds a good woman. I am sorry for my weakness, but oh, I miss my Billy so." Serenity invaded her being, and she was able to return to her workaday world with renewed courage and faith. Margaret's workaday world was truly that. She continued to toil and save and work towards the day when she would be able to pay off the debts still owed on the land which she and Billy had so lovingly accumulated. There were times when she would remember what now seemed to have been the halcyon days before Billy died. It must have been something about the work then that was different. She had worked long, hard days then, but those days were colored in hues of rose and gold. Of course, she knew what the difference was. Then she was working alongside the man she loved, and they were working towards a future together. Now she was alone, and she toiled alone. Then there were moments when she could put the work aside, but those times were almost non-existent now. Then she had pictured her old age being spent as a lady, the lady of the manor, with her hands folded and her feet resting on the little footstool. Now she watched her hands grow red and calloused. There was no time for beauty treatment with glycerin and rose water. Margaret skimped and saved and toiled and sold piece by piece the precious bits of land in order to accumulate the money she was determined to raise. By selling her land and keeping the few travelers who brave the dangers of the highways these days, she managed to keep her home, the taxes paid, and still put a little aside towards the payment of the debt. She kept the money in a strong box safely hidden away. The winter months passed. The cool showers slipped into the green of spring, brimming with it hope. Margaret was still saving and hoarding the precious money. It was on a warm spring day, with the trees and flowers putting forth their beauty for the world to see, that it finally happened. It was as though the new birth of the earth was repeated in Margaret's heart as she counted the money. Could it be possible? She counted it again. Yes, it was all there. There was finally enough money to pay off the debts that were owed on the land. It was with a happy heart that Margaret sent for the boys to come to her room. Being summoned to Mother's bedroom was not a thing to be taken lightly, and the boys, though responding immediately to the call, were somewhat fearful as they entered. They knew some announcement would be forthcoming, and were apprehensive as to what it would entail. "Boys," Margaret smiled as she greeted her assembled sons and laid their fears to rest. They were sure this was going to be one of the good meetings. "I have told you many times of your father's love of land. It has meant a great deal to us, much more than worthless money would have been. However, When your father was taken from us, we still owed two debts, one to his father's estate and one to the Colonel Wog estate. If there had been no war, we would have long ago paid off both of these debts in full amount. At last, now we have enough money. I have decided that I want to go to Wilkesboro in person to pay off these debts. I haven't been back there since I left as a girl. I would like to see the place once again and all your father's people. I've worked so long and hard to save this money that I just want to be there myself to see the debts written off the books." Of course, the boys were happy that their mother's dream of having the farm debt-free was coming true. She looked so happy as she sat there talking about returning to Wilkes County. "When do you want to go, Ma?" asked Pitt. "I've been doing some thinking about that. I think I'll wait until fall. Then the heavy work will be behind us, and we may have a few more travelers to take care of in the inn during the summer months. Yes, I believe I'll plan to go in October. We usually have beautiful October weather. Besides, I can save some more money during the summer to pay the expenses of the trip." So it was decided. The boys returned to their chores, and Margaret sat and rocked happily for a while before she, too, returned to her duties. Spring mellowed into summer and summer into fall. Preparations for Margaret's triumphal return to Wilkes County were underway. "Ma, do you want me to take you on your trip?" asked Pitt. "No, I think I'll take McLean with me. You've been there several times, and I would like for McLean to get to know his grandmother and the rest of your father's family." As Margaret packed the lunch for them to eat on the long, tiresome trip, she thought happily of her life before she came to Cherokee County. She was just a girl, hardly in her teens when she had left Wilkes County, but she well remembered the days in the little log cabin when she was but a child, and her parents were young and strong and healthy. Grandmother Walker was beside herself with joy as she greeted Billy's wife and his son. "Oh, Margaret, I am so happy you came instead of sending one of the boys. I've been praying for this. It is a great reward of my old age. I had almost given up hopes of ever seeing you again. Just think, it's been 32 years since you and your people and my Billy left here in 1839. How I cried after the wagon train pulled out. I was only a child then. It's been a long time, not only in years, but so much has happened in those years since we left here." "Do you remember what I said to you when I told you goodbye?" asked Grandmother Walker. "I certainly do. You told me to take good care of Billy, and I did my best." "You were such a child you couldn't understand, but I had a feeling I knew what was going to happen. I remember you blushed when I said those words to you." Then she became pensive. "How I have missed seeing you and Billy." "I know," whispered Margaret. The following day, Margaret walked proudly to the North Wilkesboro courthouse to make the final payment on her debt and to receive her receipts. After the business was completed, the group gathered with the Walker clan. There was James Padden, who had wrote the receipts for the Woggs' estates, and tottering old John Wogg, who had come to Wilkes County on the same wagon train that had brought baby Margaret and her parents from Pennsylvania, who was executor of the Wogg estate. Also in the group was John Brown, clerk of court, Benjamin Walker and Franklin Adams, who were executors of the Charles Walker estate. Other friends gathered in: James Finley, Joel Vanoy, who had gone to Cherokee County on the same wagon train with Margaret and Billy. William Hubbard was also there. Margaret returned to her home in Valleytown with a deep sense of pleasure and the satisfaction of a job well done. She had always enjoyed renewing old acquaintances, and had especially enjoyed visiting with Billy's mother, but she was happy to be back home in the beautiful valley by the Junaluska Creek.